Hello, my name is Sakira Francis. I attended Delphi University as an undergraduate psychology student. I identify as a cisgender Black woman, and I'll get into how that is important later. Today, I'm breaking down some of the concepts behind racism and explaining why it is an important social issue to discuss. Firstly, I want to define racism as well as colorism and explain how science has been important to support claims of racial difference. Racism is a belief that race is a fundamental determinant of human traits and capabilities, and that racial differences produce an inherent superiority of a particular race. This is a definition that I pulled up from Merriam-Webster dictionary, but everyone can have their own definition of what racism is. Believe it or not, the discussion about race didn't start until the 17th and 18th century. This is around the time when people wanted an explanation on why people from different regions look differently, as well as establish that white people are a superior race. Why? Because it gave them a reason for slavery, as they would seem like heroes for colonizing Africans who seemed to lack mental capacity. To provide evidence of these claims, they stated that physical attributes such as the skull and skin color can determine wealth, intelligence, and criminality, and sometimes categorize them as a different species. This is what Sadie Perez explains in her research on the history of racism in science. They also created IQ tests to show that Europeans and Americans were more intelligent than Africans, but these tests were heavily biased, as Africans didn't receive proper education to know how to read and write in English and understand the history and customs of Americans and Europeans. In modern society, science has a totally different view on race. Through various research dealing with the human genome, scientists concluded that race is not biological. For example, in a Stanford study, the researchers discovered that over 92% of alleles were found in two or more regions, and almost half of the alleles studied were present in all seven major geographical regions. There was so much ambiguity between the races and so much variation within them that two people of European descent may be more genetically similar to an Asian person than they are to each other. Thus, there is no evidence that the groups we commonly call races have extinct unifying genetic identities. In fact, there is ample variation within races. This means that many of the differences between people of different colors are simply due to either genetic expression or genetic linkage. Genetic expression is simply how genes choose to show themselves, while genetic linkage is when genes that are close together tend to be inherited together. And this is an important thing to highlight, as things like melanin and hair texture can often be linked together. That's why oftentimes Black people have more kinky and curly hair as well as more melanin and dark skin, because these just happen to be inherited more often together. Next, I'm talking about colorism. Colorism is prejudice or discrimination, especially within a racial or ethnic group, favoring people with lighter skin or over those with darker skin. As well as the racism definition, this has also come from the Merriam-Webster dictionary. I feel that colorism is important to discuss along with racism, as colorism stems from the ideas behind racism. Colorism dictates that lighter skin is preferred over darker skin. This is seen throughout our daily lives. Lighter skinned actresses are often preferred over darker skinned actresses. Skin bleaching and lightening are common beauty practices, and many of these types of products are easily accessible and highly advertised. Not to mention, people tend to associate negative traits to people of darker skin and even find them less attractive. These are all ideas that racism has made more acceptable in society, and it has evolved in a way that people who have experienced racism starts to internalize those attributes and causes discrimination within their own racial groups. And that's why colorism is also an important aspect to consider or start to talk about, because we don't really see the effects of racism on the community that it is oppressing. Next, I will discuss intersectionalism and how it plays an important role on this realm of identity. Intersectionalism is a complex, cumulative way in which the effects of multiple forms of discrimination such as racism, sexism, and classism combine, overlap, or intersect, especially in the experience of marginalized groups or individuals. This is from the Merriam-Webster Dictionary. Our identity can be broken down into multiple parts, such as gender, sex, race, and sexuality. As I mentioned in the beginning, I identified as a cisgender Black woman. I couldn't understand the struggles of a cisgender white woman or a cisgender Black man, and that's because my personal experiences do not match those. It puts me in a smaller category or group. I brought up intersectionality because sometimes we fail to realize that different identities within a race will have different experiences with racism. Here are some examples. Black men who face police brutality receive more publicity than Black women who do. Black men are associated with criminality while Black women are associated with either being ghetto or gold diggers. Black girls tend to be over-sexualized and Black boys tend to be treated like grown men. It could also be seen that Black trans individuals face more hate crimes and evictions than their peers. These are all instances of racism, but different identities overlap in a way that creates a unique form of discrimination. And this is because all of these identities are important and essential in how we interact with the world and the groups we interact with. I wanted to discuss the social implications of racism. Today I chose to focus on education as well as the police and prison systems due to the social climate we are facing in 2020. The first social implication I wanted to talk about was education. Although this year schools have become remote, there is a clear divide between them. Students from poorly funded school districts are usually a minority, and they themselves might come from working class families. When schools went remote, many of these students did not have a computer or tablet at home, or even internet for that matter. Even if schools wanted to provide students with iPads to do remote learning, not every student was catered to. Even in a regular school environment, these schools are often not even funded enough to afford materials such as textbooks, workbooks, or equipment to elevate the quality of learning for students. Another thing that is an issue with racial discrimination in school is the fact that a majority of predominantly minority schools tend to police the students in a way where they have to go through scanning, wanding, and maybe even have their phones confiscated. Students should have to be treated like criminals. It will affect the students' feelings about themselves and promotes the idea that students of color are predominantly more likely to become criminals. Racial discrimination also carries on into higher education. It is harder for students of color to attend college because some of them may not have the grades required due to performing hindering stress, as well as their families may not be able to afford a high cost tuition. And maybe they can't even take out loans. According to the Pew Research Center, 81% of Black people stated they have experienced racial discrimination in school too. This varies from being considered suspicious to not being considered smart enough to attend college. There are cases where US students have reported being told to go back to their countries and even have slurs hurled against them. The second implication I want to discuss is police and prison systems. Starting with police brutality, the Black community has been increasing awareness of this issue with the light of deaths of Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and many others caused by police officers. This brought the revival of the Black Lives Matter movement that started in 2014. However, there is a split in the public view on whether police brutality or even police differential treatment even exists. In a NAACP data collection, 84% of Black adults say white people are treated better than Black people by police. 63% of white adults agreed based on this 2019 research on police relations. This means 16% of Black adults and 37% of white adults disagree. However, their reasons for this is unclear. But there is something I know for sure. Police should be more trained on using lethal, non-lethal methods of detaining and knowing how to control the amount of force they use. This means making police training longer than a few months. I also feel that their examination process should be longer as well, to examine the societal views of these police officers in training. This is because some police officers can criminally profile innocent people of color based off the notion that their race is more likely to commit crime. This leads to unjust arrests and may result in instances of police brutality. We need to filter out people who are more likely to make these racially charged assumptions from the police recruitment system. Lastly, I want to touch on mass incarceration. Many of the African American men who have been incarcerated over the years have been incarcerated for what may seem as petty crimes. For example, only 5% of African Americans are illicit drug users, yet they are 29% of illicit drug arrests, which can be up to 6 times greater than the arrest of white illicit drug users. I also find it unfair that those who are sentenced for marijuana possession or growing and distributing are still in jail when states have now either legalized it or are allowing them to become businesses and college courses. These systems are heavily embedded with racial underlining that need to be examined and reformed to allow for fairness for all. Now I just want to take some time to present the responses from a survey I sent out on our sample size and Instagram, so you can see what others think on what I covered. Because the survey was anonymous, the only identifying qualities for each of the participants is their age group and their ethnicity if they chose to disclose it. These are the responses dealing with education. You can take a pause and read them if you like. These are some of the responses dealing with police and prison. For both education and police and prison, I left open-ended questions that every responder can answer to. They could disagree or they can agree. I found there's these interesting differences between every responses. Some people are unsure how racism are seen in these categories. Some people refuse to make a comment of it because in their community it's not really a thing and they don't feel like they have the jurisdiction to discuss racism. But all in all, I felt everyone had a very interesting viewpoint and I wanted to share it. I also will put a link to the survey I gave out so you can take it yourself as well as see a summary of all the data that went into it because I didn't have enough time to fully analyze and give you a deep dive into it, but you can take the time to do it yourself. Thank you for watching. There's links to all the sources that I used, cited, or took ideas from in the description section. You can feel free to leave your opinions in the comment section below as well. I want to encourage more discussion on this topic as well as bring input from communities such as Hispanics, Muslims, Jews, white people, simply because a lot of my data may have been more focused on Black people than it has on other minorities who may experience racism or the point of view of those who are the oppressors. So feel free to discuss and give your viewpoints.